Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game.
I got board game.
I got board game. I'm Ben,
I'm John.
and today we are here to do a review of another older game in modern gaming. So among modern board games. But it was very popular when it came out. Still a pretty popular gateway game, I would say, which has a lightweight, family weight feel to it, with a theme that might appeal more to maybe like kids
And adults.
and us.
30-year-olds, 30 plus.
And that game is
Godzilla versus King Kong.
Oh yeah, good.
Copyright. Don't close this down. Don't shut this down.
The game is
King of Tokyo.
King of Tokyo.
Richard Garfield.
Richard Garfield, King of Tokyo. And so as you can see just right now, the art is a little different from my version that I'm showing and the image that John has. I'll explain that later on. Just basically different editions. Yeah. But we'll be talking, they should play the same. So we'll be doing a brief overview, rough idea of how it plays, and then we'll get into our thoughts on the game. It is by Richard Garfield, who, for people who are new to the board gaming world, Richard Garfield is a big name because he made a small game called Magic the Gathering.
Tiny, light collectible card game.
Yeah, collectible card game, only like 30 years old.
It's only existed since like 1970s, 1980s, whatever.
Yes, he is a creator of Magic the Gathering and another game around that time called Robo Rally, and other games over the year, including King of Tokyo, which is very different from Magic the Gathering, so don't feel intimidated if you do know what Magic is like. Very different kind of game. And then even modern games too today, like I think a couple years ago, a big one he did was Key Forge, which was a different take on a card game system. But yeah, so for King of Tokyo, it came out in, I believe, 2011 is what Board Game Geek said. So it's been 10 years. So it's old among modern board games.
Yep.
But it plays, it says 2 to 6 players, and it says 30 minutes, which I think that is about right. And so, yeah, like I said, going into a overview of how the game will flow. Let me just share this image. So here's an image of just the components so far. Like you have the box, and then you have your standees of the monsters in the game that the players get to play as. Yeah, so in this game, you are basically giant monsters or kaijus, if you guys know, like, Godzilla and King Kong and those kind of classic big monster characters from those movies, often called kaijus. You are playing as one of them to become the King of Tokyo, and you'll do that by gaining victory points or being the last one standing, basically beating up all the other monsters / players. And so, yeah, in the game, you'll choose to be one of the monsters, which in this base version, which is what we're talking about, there isn't really any difference. Their art is the only part that's different about them, but there's no gameplay difference. There's no special powers that differentiate them or anything. But you can choose, legally distinct King Kong monkey and legally distinct Godzilla lizard, and etc. So you'll choose your monster, and then you can see there's a deck of basically power-up cards or ability cards, green translucent cubes, which indicate energy, which is kind of the resource you'll manage in this game. You'll have these different tokens that indicate different special effects, like poisoned and stuff like that certain cards might inflict. And then you have the custom dice for the game, and then of course you also have your little player tracker that you'll take with the monster you choose, and it's basically just to track your hit points, your life, and your victory points that you're gathering. And so to go over to a picture of the game set up, This is basically how to look when you set it up. I know it's blurry right now, but it should get clearer as my computer. There you go.
Hey.
And so you also have one of the components is this kind of smaller board indicating Tokyo, which has basically two spots on it. Tokyo City and Tokyo Bay, which are both considered Tokyo in this game, and then a reference for kind of getting points and stuff while you're in Tokyo. And then you'll also shuffle the deck of ability cards, and you'll deal out three. So there's always three shown in the market at a time. And then you'll have basically your supply of energy cubes and then the dice. And so there are 6 of these regular dice. And what will happen during the game is basically you're going to go and take turns clockwise, where on someone's turn, they're going to go through basically 3 phases. They're first going to take all 6 dice, and they're, as the active player, that being their turn, they're going to roll all the dice. And in this game, one of basically the main mechanics is what's often called Yahtzee dice rolling. Basically taking how Yahtzee, that board game, does their dice roll. And so if you don't know what that is, what Yahtzee dice rolling is, it basically means you have 3 chances to roll your dice. And basically on each attempt, after you roll, you can choose to keep dice or set them aside and not roll them. So you can kind of select the symbols that were rolled and to keep while you re-roll the other ones to try to get more of something that you want from them. And you basically get 3 dice rolled to do this. So you could roll the first time, all of them, set aside a couple, then re-roll the rest, set aside another, but maybe take in one of the ones you previously set aside because you changed your mind on what you're trying to get, and then roll a third time, and then you have those final results. And so it's up to 3 times. So you can even stop after you like your second roll if you like what you rolled. And then after you roll your dice, you'll resolve what you ended up landing on, deciding to end with. And so there are basically like 4 different kinds of symbols on the dice. There's basically this claw. There's 3 sides numbered 1, 2, 3. There's the heart, and then this lightning bolt that you can see, hopefully, that I'm pointing at on your screen. And so basically, the 1, 2, and 3 are ways to get points. You basically need 3 of the same number to get that many victory points, and you'll mark that on your tracker board on the victory point portion. Hearts will heal you 1 life per heart. And then the lightning bolt will get you 1 energy per lightning bolt symbol. And then the claw symbol is an attack symbol. So each one of those will hit other players depending on where you are. And so when there aren't any players in Tokyo, the first person to roll a claw will go into Tokyo on their turn. And that just basically gives them a way to get bonus victory points every time it comes back to their turn. And basically, yeah, the symbols on the bottom of the board. I'm not going to go into all the specifics, but they do get a bonus of starting their turn in Tokyo. So that's why you kind of want to be there as long as you can to gather the most points for free. But then also while you're there, your attacks hit all the other players, where then all the other players' attacks hit just you. And so then when you're hit on another player's turn, then you can choose whether to leave Tokyo and it forces them into Tokyo, or you can push your luck and stay there if you think you can continue to live. And so that's basically what the symbols do. There's basically attack, healing, getting energy, or getting victory points. And then after you resolve those dice, you have an optional phase of using whatever energy cubes you have from this round all the way and added up from previous rounds that you accumulated to buy these ability cards or upgrade cards for their cost in the top left corner of each card. And you can also spend 2 energy to just clear all 3 of these and draw 3 new ones. And you can buy as much as you have the energy to buy that turn. And so when you buy something, you just replace it with a new card. And these cards are either keep cards, which are basically upgrades that, give you an ability that's ongoing, such as, when you roll a certain die face, it'll also do this or give you a bonus victory point or such like that. Or there's also discard cards, which are basically one-time use and they immediately happen when you buy them. such as this one looks like you just immediately get, it looks like 3 victory
3 points.
points.
It looks like. Yeah.
And so that'll be your turn after you've rolled, re-rolled, resolved your dice, and chosen to do any purchasing to the market. And after that, you pass the dice to the player to your left clockwise, and it's their turn. And then this will repeat until one player reaches 20 victory points first, or like I said, they're the last one standing. They basically beat out every other player, defeated every other monster, knocking their life down to 0. And at that point, you're the king of Tokyo and the winner of the game. And so that's how the game plays.
Victory.
And so with that, I had mentioned this game is a family weight game. And so as you can see with those mechanics, right, mainly again focusing on the Yahtzee dice rolling, it is very easy to learn, hopefully, as you can tell from the way I just taught it. But with
And
that
that's our
said,
review. The end. And I said, and that's our review. The
Yeah.
end. No,
easy to learn. There you go. But no, I mean, I just wanted to make that point clear. This is like a family weight game. And so hopefully it does come across that way with how simple it was to teach the game just now. But with that, we'll go into our pros, starting with John.
Yeah. So go buy it. That's my no, just kidding. as Ben explained, right? This is it's a very easy to pick up game. Most people have played Yahtzee or some variation of Yahtzee in some kind of dice rolling style of game. So I'd say in terms of the pros, it's a pretty fun game because just the concept is something that is from a gameplay mechanic is something that I think a lot of people just recognize and know, right? From maybe childhood games that you played on the playgrounds or out in the streets, during elementary school and stuff. Like King of Tokyo basically is kind of running off that theme of being king of the hill, right? So in this game, that's basically what you're doing. You're trying to be the king of the hill, getting the most points, or being the last one standing for that. So I would say in this game, that's a really great pro and a nice part of this game is that feeling of trying to figure out what you want to do. It's like, do I want to have the most points at the end of this game because I see like I have a lot of points in the game, or it's like, oh, I'm in the middle. I get to hit everybody, so I can do lots of damage and try to like knock out all my opponents as soon as I can. So it's very simple in that way too. And I think even though it says kind of like 8 and older, this is the type of game that even if you were playing with someone who is a little bit younger than 8, you could probably still even play the game because really it's just rolling these dice a few times and then just basically doing the actions that it takes. And there's really not too much deliberation or decision making you have to do other than maybe the power-up cards themselves, which might be a little bit more difficult for younger audiences just because it's reading and it's the comprehension. But otherwise, it's pretty self-explanatory in that way. So I think this is, as mentioned, I think that's one of the really strong points about this game is you can really just jump right into it, get going, just start playing the game.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why the game got so many awards over the years too. Like I think my version being like the second printing, like there's a lot of printings of this game in a lot of different languages.
Yeah.
You can look on Board Game Geek, like you can see pictures of covers of all different language versions, like Russian, Korean, Chinese, like all different versions. And like the version I have even shows like was printed with a bunch of the awards on it, like Seal of Excellence, Dice Tower Best Family Game Winner 2011, Golden Geek Award. And so, and I think a big part of that is just how easy it is to get into, like you were saying. And I think why, like adding to that point, why I think it's so easy, but also enjoyable for people to get into is because it's basically still going off of the same mechanic that people know from Monopoly. Right, like dice rolling, that is the main mechanic of the game. Like obviously your goal is to, you're kind of deciding along the way, do I want to push for victory points or can I end up knocking people out? Like that's kind of your two paths to go. But the main mechanic of just rolling dice, it's people know how that works, right? It's chance. But why it's so enjoyable is because it uses that Yahtzee dice rolling, where then it's not like Monopoly, where you roll and move and that's it. Yeah, you just roll the one time and you just have to move that and deal with what happens. You get to push your luck, right? You're rolling 6 dice and you get to re-roll them twice to try to get what you want. So there is that more sense of control to it, right? Obviously, it's still all chance, but there is that sense of control because you can, in a sense, lock down dice that you already rolled what you wanted for that turn or what you were aiming for. Like, oh, I want to hit everyone this turn, so every time I roll a claw, I'm just going to set that aside. So, you can kind of control your luck a little bit in that way, and that feels, that little bit, you feel it, and that's what makes it so enjoyable.
Yeah. And kind of bouncing off of that idea, I think that's why this is definitely a game that took it beyond your kind of what we're comparing it to with this Monopoly sense of just rolling dice, or even in the Yahtzee sense of like, in Yahtzee, typically what you're trying to do is you're rolling for kind of hands of dice, which is very similar to poker, right? There's you try to do pairings or three of a kinds or straights, small straights, all that kind of stuff. Where while that might be interesting in Yahtzee, it's also still pretty basic because it's always based on the pips of your dice or the numbers on the dice. But in this game, I think that's the thing, the beauty of the selection of the different options that you can take with the dice, where, as Ben was mentioning, right, during the rules, is there's kind of 4 different types of rolls that you could be aiming for. And that kind of changes the way you think about your dice, where it's not just like, oh, I'm trying to roll a 2 or I'm just trying to roll a 3 because, that'll help me get my straight or that'll help me get my pair. And that's kind of it. You're actually thinking like, do I want to roll this dice to maybe try to get an energy, or maybe I'm trying to get more claws, or I'm trying to heal because I just got hit a lot, right? So you actually have to think differently about the decision that you're making with those dice as you roll it. Or it's like, as we talked about, like maybe you're like, oh, I really want to hit people, but then when maybe you rolled a couple claws early on your first roll, but then the second roll you roll 3 threes with the remaining dice, and you're like, I just got 3 points straight away. Do I actually want to hit twice now with the dice? And you have to kind of start making more decisions because of that, because it's not just one roll just kind of sets you and locks you in. But as Ben mentioned, like there's a lot of different strategic decisions you make, and they're not that complicated. I think that's the other really nice thing about those decisions. It's not like you have to think like 5 steps ahead of like, oh, I rolled these 3 threes, which means that three turns later, I'm going to be able to do this thing with this thing, right? It's like, you don't really have to think that far ahead. You're just like, what I rolled is what I'm going to get right away. The only one that maybe is an exception to that is how you use energy. But even energy, it's very straightforward. You get 1 energy for 1 electric, like 1 lightning symbol. So it's not, that's also not that complicated. And then you can just see what are the powers on the board. You see how much they cost. So you're like, okay, maybe if I get more energy, I'll be able to buy a card this turn. Or you're just like, I can't buy anything even if I rolled a bazillion energy. So I'm just going to keep going, right? But it's very straightforward with those decisions you make with the dice in this version of the game. So that's very, very nice to not have to worry about, and you just kind of go for it.
Yeah, and I think then there are the small things that I didn't mention in the overview because I was just trying to keep it brief, but some things that are nice little design choices are like in the example you're giving of like, I ended up rolling 3 threes, which would get me 3 points because I have 3 of that number. Then do I want to re-roll my rest to try to get other 3s? Because then each additional 3 you roll is another 1 point, right? But I think that's a nice small design choice that still makes it maybe worth doing, right? Versus if they only made the rule like once you roll 3 of a number, that's as many points as you're going to get, right? But it's like, oh no, you can still get 1 more point for each of the same number that you also roll after that pair, that trio that you first rolled. And so that's like a little smart design choice, that gives a little more decision making for you. Small decision making though, right? It's just another point or not if you want to push your luck for it. The other thing is also when you're in Tokyo, I did mention that your attacks hit everyone, which can feel great. Like you can take out multiple players at the same time then. But then the other rule is like when you roll hearts, you don't get to heal in Tokyo.
Yeah.
And I think that's smart because obviously if you could heal, you would just stay there as long as you can. And then just maybe roll 1 hit per turn and all the rest try to aim for hearts so that you're slowly just beating up everyone and they can't kill you, you know?
Yeah.
So it's smart that they made it that way where eventually, if you're playing with enough players, all their attacks are hitting you. So you're gonna at some point need to leave. And then it's that push your luck again, like, can I survive? Will John actually roll enough hits to get me, or is he gonna go for something else?
6 claws, baby.
Claws, yeah. And so yeah, again, that's like another small design choice of saying like, Tokyo's powerful, so there's this negative to it. And so then that forces you to get out at some point, maybe.
Yeah.
And so those are all small little things I think were clever and easy to understand. I just explained those rules to you, which were basically some of the only other rules to know about those spots. And so, yeah, just smart choices with that. But I did want to say, for me, when I think of King of Tokyo, there's two big pros. And the first one was the first thing we talked about. I think that Yahtzee dice rolling is just it was really big, I think, when he did it in this game, in the board game industry at the time, because now when people mention Yahtzee dice rolling, they still obviously call it that as a mechanic, but people often compare it to King of Tokyo. Like this game, even if it's a large game and it includes this mechanic, they're like, yeah, it uses Yahtzee dice rolling like King of Tokyo. It's like, oh, okay, I get it. So that's one of the big pros I would have. But the second big pro is kind of an overall design concept with the game that kind of sounds like what you had touched upon already, John. But the idea with the theme of the game, I had also mentioned that it could appeal to like kids more, right? It has that kind of colorfulness, but kind of grand, kind of fantastical aspect to it, right? This kaiju kind of movie theme to it. But then from a gameplay standpoint, what's so interesting about that is the game then becomes a game that's both fighting, but then also about getting victory points, right? And kind of leaves it up to you which way you want to play. And that was pretty different at the time too in the board game industry. And I would say even still nowadays, like you see it a lot more now, but it's this idea of two of the biggest genre of board games coming together, which are terms which I don't think we've talked about yet in an IGBG Explains, but it's basically a Euro game and an Ameritrash game. Those are kind of two very big, broad categories in the board gaming world, where some of the defining characteristics of an Ameritrash game is basically a game where you're fighting each other, trying to beat each other up, and you have hit points and attacks and maybe weapons and stuff. And then Euro games are games often originally around like farming and agriculture theme, maybe industry related, but then basically non-confrontational games where then you're striving for victory points. Those are some of the key characteristics. And so to bring those together in a game where you can fight or you can get victory points, it's both of these put together. And I think that's what also is so clever about the game.
And kind of just pushing on that one a little bit more too, I think it's very, as Ben was saying, it's very nicely balanced too in that sense, right? Where this game, I've played many types of both this game, and we'll talk about some expansions and things later on, but like I've played many rounds of this game, and I have seen both ways of winning happen multiple times, right? Like it's not like I feel like, oh, beating up other players is the only real viable strategy, or point collection is the only real viable strategy. Both of them have equal chances and equal opportunities for winning, right? Partly because it is based on the dice that are rolled, and then something that we didn't also talk about is the power-ups that also may show up and appear as you're playing through the game that you can collect, because as we noted, there's going to be three different power-ups that are going to be in the board that you can see, and they all do have different effects. Some of them are focused on, as we saw in Ben's kind of snapshot that he showed earlier, is like just getting points straight away. But then there's other cards that do other kind of special effects and different kinds of things. Some of them help you get points over time, depending on maybe where you rank in terms of how many points you do or how many victory points you have compared to other players. Or some of them, like the one on the far right there, is like healing, right? There's an ability to heal other people, and by doing that, it does something beneficial for you, right? Because usually you'd be like, why would I want to heal other players? but it does something that will give you a benefit for doing that. And then there's some cards that are very defensive, where they let you stay protected even if you're in Tokyo, or some that help you do a lot more damage, where it's like if you roll a certain amount of hits, that you'll be able to like deal extra damage to a player or something like that, or to all players, right? Even. And so, and as we mentioned, there was even the sides, the small kind of cardboard tokens that you get, the punch outs that you can use, that are applied to some of these power-ups that may do other additional effects to like prevent healing or something else, or something along those lines. So I think the power-ups are also really thematic and really fit into this, this game really well, because when you're talking about being a kaiju, right, and kind of this, even this concept of just, I'm a giant monster, I should feel strong, I should feel powerful. Getting these power-up cards and being able to utilize them really gives you that feeling of being, strong. And like it's kind of like if you watch those old cartoons or those old shows about this, where you see the characters and they yell out their superpower, their super attack, and they're like, I don't know, like fireball or like laser eye beams, and it's like, that's what you imagine these monsters to be when you see them in those old shows and those old movies. And it's like, I get to be that. I get to do that with my monster, or with the monster character I'm playing. So that's a nice feeling that also comes from the game too, in addition. So,
and then for me, the last pro I would mention is obviously a smaller one from the other two I had pointed out, but it's just a production. It's really good. Like this is I believe my version is like the first edition, like maybe like a later printing or second printing. But I don't think it's really any different from the first one. It's just maybe the cover has those awards and stuff on it. But like this inside is the custom insert to fit the cards, the gems, all the dice, the monsters and their tracker boards, and then the little standees for your monsters. And so it all fits really well, and it's snug, well produced. Like the dice, even though they're custom, they're not like, I don't find them really like flaking. Like I had come across maybe one or two games, that felt more indie that way. Like the dice quality wasn't that good. But these dice are chunky, fine, nicely colored, as you can see in the picture. And so, yeah, the production's great. I mean, Yellow, the publisher is Yellow Games, IELLO, which has been in the industry for a long time. Like they're a big name in the industry. So their production, though it might seem pretty kind of standard among their games, like it is a good standard. It's not like the same as like modern miniature board games or anything like that, because these are still just like standees with the monsters, but it's fine for this kind of lightweight game. Just good production. And personally, I do like obviously the custom insert that fits everything well for storage. So yeah, I think that's a good part of the game. And so with that, I think we will go on to the cons that we have for the game. And so starting with John.
Yeah, so keep in mind that we are reviewing specific King of Tokyo base game as it is. So this first con is kind of ironically knowing what's coming or knowing what exists with expansions. But I will say one of the shortcomings of this particular, of this first iteration of the game is, even though, and I was just harping about how great powers are and how it feels to have powers, there is something lacking about the fact that the monsters in and of themselves are not different from one another, right? Like we mentioned at the beginning, basically it's just kind of like skins for you as a player, but there's nothing that distinguishes this, kaiju from this kaiju, or this kaiju from the other kaiju that's hiding behind me in the picture, right? Like in the base game, you just are what you are, but like the skin is just a flavor to the game. And then like the power-ups aren't specific to a specific monster, right? Like when you're going through that power-up deck, it's just open generic for everybody to pick up. So as I was mentioning, it's cool that you can maybe get this power of like shooting fireballs or like laser eye beams or something. But then if I'm like this, if I'm the King Kong like monster, laser eye beams maybe from his cybernetic eye kind of makes sense, but really it kind of doesn't really feel like it makes sense, right, with the monster, right? So it's not really, it doesn't feel like the powers are directly inherent to the particular monster. So as a base game, like if I'm telling you about this game, like, oh, this is like, this really easy game to get into where you play as kaiju and these giant monsters fighting each other. I think the initial impression would be, like, oh, do I get like superpowers or I get special abilities and special powers in the base game? Only until you buy them, basically. So that is a small shortcoming, and I don't think it's a huge shortcoming, but it is a shortcoming of this version of the game where you don't get that kind of feel of uniqueness as your kaiju. So,
Yeah, that's one of the main things I think people did point out originally when the game
mhm.
had come out, and then soon after was released what you were hinting at, the first expansion to the game called the Power Up expansion or Power Up pack, which then introduced a new character for you, a Panda Kai,
Yep.
a panda, giant panda guy, not even monster because he's like kind of kung fu and nicely dressed. Um, but in that one, then they added this new mechanic of if you end your dice rolling with 3 hearts, you get to take your a card from your monster's own evolution deck,
Yes.
and that deck is particular to each monster.
Mhm.
And so from that deck, then you'll have these evolution cards, which you can play at any time to do a one-time thing or permanently upgrade your monster. And then in that way, each monster would lean toward playing a certain way, such as the King Kong monster called King. The King, he would, I believe, have more evolutions towards getting points faster.
Mhm,
Where
mhm.
then I think Mecha, oh shoot, what is it called?
The
The
Mecha Dragon
Yeah, the
one.
Mecha Dragon one, he was about like attacking more.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
Gigazor, the Godzilla one, I think was more maybe more about like energy generation or something like that,
Yeah.
or that might have been another one. But anyways, that's what kind of made the monsters distinct, and also deal with another small complaint of, if I end my dice roll with hearts, and I'm at full life, it doesn't do anything.
Or I'm
So
in Tokyo, right? Or I'm in
yeah, yeah,
Tokyo. Yeah.
yeah, especially if you're in Tokyo, but also if you're out, right, and you
Yeah.
can't heal at all, then yeah, it just those hearts would go to waste. So they gave that a use. And
Mhm.
so, and I think that again, small pro, even though we're in cons, was a smart design choice with that expansion, right? Like the more moments in the game you can have where your actions actually do something versus
Mhm.
just having a wasted turn or a skip turn, that makes the game more engaging.
Yeah.
But so yes, definitely that's definitely a con people would point out about the base game, especially since knowing that now, it's like, yeah, you can introduce this game to people like, yeah, it's easy, you can play it with your kids, but then to feel like you'd have to get an expansion if you want that different characterization of the monsters, uh yeah, it doesn't feel the best.
It would have been nice if that was part of the original, but I
But
mean,
like make it optional or
yeah,
something.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. For me, one of my cons is actually something that I don't think it was a con for me when I first played the game years ago. Much less now, I think, since I'm better at learning board games. But I just remember there's this difference if you look at the Tokyo board and in the pictures and such, right? There's the Tokyo City, which is always used, but then Tokyo Bay is used when there's 5 to 6 players playing. And it's basically a second spot in what is also considered Tokyo.
Mhm.
So basically, the first person who gets into Tokyo goes here, and then a second person can go into Tokyo and end up here. And so, but then they're both considered in Tokyo.
Mhm.
And so the wording can be a little confusing, maybe if what I just said confused you, but there basically can be 2 monsters considered in the middle of the game
Yeah.
board or the game area. And so then both of their attacks hit all the other monsters. And then other monsters' attacks who are outside of Tokyo, the
Hit.
game board, their attacks hit both of them.
Mhm.
And so I just remember when I was getting into board games, that was kind of confusing to play with that many players
Yeah.
and add that additional spot. And I even tried to avoid playing with 5 to 6 players, so I don't have to remember how that works.
Yeah.
Because there is a kind of uh, weird like moving around idea where, if someone on the outside of Tokyo attacks the inside 2 monsters, then they go in order and decide, oh, am I gonna leave? No. Are you gonna leave? Yes. And then that second monster in Tokyo will switch with the person who attacked. So it's just kind of an extra thing to keep track of,
Mhm.
which then can also change during the game, because I believe when there's not 5 monsters left, like when there's 4 or fewer monsters remaining in the game, then Tokyo Bay is blocked off again.
Yeah.
And so you're basically playing like a 4-player game.
Mhm.
And so it just seemed a little clunky to learn it. It's not that complicated to understand, especially, like I said, not for me now that I've learned so many games. Um, but yeah, it just seems kind of clunky. And I get why maybe design wise they had to balance it out to push it to 5 to 6 players, so that, because if it is like 6 players and there's only one person in Tokyo, like they're gonna get kicked out really quick, because
Or
just
just die
a
really
few
quick.
players, a few players attacking them will probably already make them want to leave, right? And so then the game can drag out too long if it's always going in and out really soon, in and out really soon, and people aren't getting victory points that quickly, and then just trying to heal up on their life all the time. And so,
Mhm.
but I think even behind that choice, then it might have been better to keep the game at 4, or not have Tokyo Bay and see if it actually balances that 5 players.
Yeah.
Because I think, it's kind of, it's hard to say, because it is cool that a game like this can
Mhm.
play up to 5 or 6, because that is kind of the hard number to hit with board games. Like so many board games are up to 4 players, like that's like the ideal number. And then there's like social or party games that are like 7 to 10 players.
Mhm.
But like to get it to 5 or 6, it's hard. And then a lot of games try to get it to 5 by adding some kind of rules, but then that's exactly the issue I'm describing. It can get clunky feeling. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and I would agree in terms of the clunkiness. I will say it does feel pretty nice, at least in the sense of like it is a different way of adding in the 5 to 6 players and to rebalance it once you drop down to back down to 4 players. That being said, though, I will say one of the other cons that I was going to raise is the length of time of the game actually does increase kind of a lot with the addition of additional players. Even though it's a very simple game, there are still decisions that a player makes, especially when it comes to deciding what powers you want to buy. That usually is the part that really takes the most time. That and deciding whether you're going to stay in Tokyo or not. That is the other thing. And even going to that rule, the clunkiness rule, it does slow down the game a lot when you have to consider that, because as Ben was mentioning, there's basically kind of 2 phases of decisions when you get attacked in Tokyo. It's you get the person who's in Tokyo City who decides first, because if they leave, then the player in the bay has no choice. They have to move into Tokyo City. And then the other, then the attacker moves into the city, or as was mentioned in his example, is the second player decides to leave, so then the first player doesn't move, right? Or the one in Tokyo City doesn't move. And that is a little bit kind of funky to think about, or funky to kind of keep track. But I will say, as I was saying, it's like I also think it's a really cool way of the balancing of having multiple players, because a lot of times what would be done is like maybe you just add like more turns or like an additional option for the player who's in a location is typically what happens, which makes it really weird or really awkward, especially when you're adding like there's going to be this many players before it's my turn. But in this game, by putting kind of 2 players in the same position with the same kind of decision to make, I do feel like it's a really unique way of trying to balance and trying to promote, allowing for more players, but not changing the nature of the game too much. Because ultimately, the point is you're still fighting a lot of, like, the outside monsters are still dealing a lot of damage to the ones in the center, and then the ones in the center are still kind of dishing out the damage out to everybody else. So at least in that sense, you're not, if it was only one in the middle and maybe 4 or 5 monsters on the outside without the second spot, then that's 4 or 5 other monsters all dealing damage to one. Versus by having 2 spots, the maximum outside that can hit you is 4, and then after that it would only be 3. Right at that point, if you have 5 players. So that's one of the things that I do find, like, it prevents the scaling of the damage on the outside to the players on the inside, and it also increases the scaling of the damage of the inside to the outside in that way. So I do find that's nice in that way. But I do agree it is kind of a clunky system ultimately, because it's, you still have to like stop and think about it. And I would say also a ding in that direction is the fact that there's no solid visual representation that shows you what you should be doing in that circumstance, which is kind of strange given how the symbols are actually really good in this game. Like as we mentioned in the component section and the pros, like it has a lot of good symbology and a lot of good decision making and design, but for some reason with the movement in and out of the city, just it feels like maybe there is just no good visual way of sharing how to do that, but it does feel like it falls off the mark. Like if you just saw the board alone on its own, you wouldn't know what to do with it. You have to kind of read the rules, or you'd have to really know the rules to understand how that works.
You do make a good point though. It is a different way of making it 5 to 6, which I guess makes it a smaller con for me. Still a con, but yeah, it is smaller because I didn't think of it that way, where like I think the common way to make it 5 to 6 players would have been like, oh, now you play the whole game with just rolling 4 dice, or you have to go through the deck and take out these cards that could do potentially more damage when there's more players. And that's the even clunkier way, which I don't like how games push up to 5 or 6 players, where you have to change the whole setup of like, now don't put this here and take these out of this deck here, and it's becomes too long to set up that way. So yes, so smaller con, but still a con. And then I mean, my only other con is actually something I think people also pointed out a lot back then when the game came out, was the board itself. And this is a small con too. I mean, it is well produced, nothing wrong with it, but it also almost serves no purpose. Like it is the reference for what happens when you're in Tokyo, and then obviously it's the 2 spots in Tokyo, but it's like,
that's it.
Yeah, that's it. Like I'm just like, when you're playing, like sure there's a reference here, but you're literally only using the board to put a monster in the middle of the table or take him out of the middle of the table to know that he's in Tokyo or outside of Tokyo. And it's like, you literally could have just done that without a board. Just like put your monster in the middle of the table and say, I'm in Tokyo now, and you guys aren't, and it's like I think it would have been better if they could use more of the space on the board, or make it a little bigger and have more space to put a place for like the deck of cards, like a lot of board games do, using the actual board to hold all the components, like have a spot for the deck and a spot maybe just for all your little energy cubes, just as like the bank of the cubes on the board, and then a discard pile for the cards. And I mean, even just adding that would then fit everything that you do play the game with, and it would have made full use of an actual board component. But very small. I mean, it's just kind of more the con that this is useless. It's a nice piece of art to then have some stuff on it and still show the art, but it would have been more functional if they used it for all the other components too.
Which they change in future installments.
Oh, did they?
I mean, in the sense of King of New York, right?
Yeah.
So, but we're not there yet.
But I mean, did you have any other con? If not, we'll.
Nah, not in particular. Nothing specific to call out. Just the fact that I hate when people gang up on me.
Yeah, John's a sore loser. So. And so what one thing we did want to mention before going on to the last parts of this review are, we had mentioned before that there is the power-up expansion, which was pretty monumental for this game, adding in the evolutions that made each monster distinct from each other. And so at least with the first edition that I have, there was that power-up expansion, and then a couple of other ones like a Halloween expansion, and another one that basically added another mechanic, a different kind of card that could also be used maybe similar to the evolutions, and then also other monsters like a jack-o'-lantern and a giant shark guy.
Yep.
And so those are the expansions to the game. And then there was also a sequel game called King of New York, which John has mentioned, which is a little more complex version of the game just because it uses the New York area and its boroughs. And so there's basically different locations that you can be in, like all the monsters will be in and move around on the board. And then in these locations, there are also stacks of tokens that represent like military or buildings that you can attack or be attacked by for being in that borough. But if you attack them and defeat them, you can also get like temporary or one-time bonuses, like getting life back or something like that. And so it adds those kind of components to the game and that to the setup, which makes it a little heavier than this version. But if this version is kind of too light for you, but you like the kind of combat or a victory point mechanic, and then especially with the the Yahtzee dice rolling dice. What did I say? Anyways,
Yahtzee dying.
the Yahtzee dice rolling mechanic, then you might want to look into King of New York and see if that adds a little bit more that makes it gamery enough for you. But aside from those, I think the last thing I would want to point out is I've been mentioning my version is the first edition of the game. And so what you'll find nowadays, I believe, is what John is showing in his background. And I'll also show a picture now. So this is like the version that I have, the cover on the front. But then the ones you'll find nowadays are the second edition, which came out in 2016, which I believe plays exactly the same, just new art style to all the monsters and the cards now. I don't believe this is compatible with the first edition. It basically is to replace the first edition. But like I said, I think this is also the one you'll find now. So, they just kind of modernized some of the characters even more and included the Penguin, which I believe was a promo character in the first edition. They made him an actual character in the second edition. So yeah, mainly just an art difference, but this is the one you'll find now. Should be exactly the same game as we've been talking about. And so
I did
with
want
that,
to go. Oh, sorry. I was going to say just a quick note, just to go back to the point you were making about the sequel game. Just know that sequel is a standalone sequel. It is not compatible with King of Tokyo. So also know that about that game too. Is if you have King of Tokyo, if you wanted to play King of New York, you have to buy it because as we're saying, it's not just the map, but it's also the dice are different because there is that specific change to the attacking of structures. So that changes the types of dice that you have. So you cannot play King of New York with the King of Tokyo set. It is a completely separate standalone.
Yeah, true. And actually the only part that could be compatible is if you want to use the same monsters from the King of Tokyo version in King of New York, because again, in King of New York, the monsters are still also just skins, like they don't have any distinct features to them. But I believe King of New York then later on had its own power-up expansion, which then made their monsters unique for their game. And in that case, then you would not be able to use the King of Tokyo monsters with their power-ups in that game. But just base game-wise, you could use the same monster standees that you like from King of Tokyo in King of New York.
Yep.
So with that, going on to John's rating, and John guesses the weight.
Wait.
Kaiju weight.
So I would say in terms of my rating, I would give this game a 7.0 rating. I think it's a very solid game as a starter game, family game. You can play this with a lot of people, which is really nice, up to 6 players, which as we mentioned is a kind of unique number to allow for. And it's down to 2 players. So it's between 2 to 6 players. So that's already itself. Those are really great claims. Because we are specifically doing just King of Tokyo, that's why I'm giving it a 7.0 because of some of the aforementioned kind of cons that do get solved in later expansions. But because the base game in and of itself did not deal with those things, did not, take care of it, that's why I I'm bumping it down a little bit from what I would say, like if you had the whole collection of King of Tokyo and all of its kind of expansion packs that came afterward, or expansion boxes. I think it's super solid game. I have a lot of fun with it. I do enjoy playing it the few times. I probably wouldn't play this all of the time, right? Like it's not something that I want to play all of the time in that sense. I'm not like raring to go like the only game I want to play is King of Tokyo. But if someone recommends it or someone's interested in playing it, I'm more than happy to throw down so then I can prove that I'm the strongest kaiju. And it's nice because it's also overall it's a pretty quick game. It's not something that's too intensive in that way. That being said, when we're talking about the weight, my guess of the weight is 2.21, because it's not super heavy, but there is some decision making involved in the game. It's not purely dice rolling, so I'm thinking it's more than a 1.
I'm not
in the
I'm
2
not
territory. It's my guess.
2.21. So I'm not gonna let you change your guess, but I'm gonna say that pushes towards like a medium game, right?
I know. I just realized I pushed way too high.
Like
it's been a while. Okay, the last couple of games I didn't do weight, so it's been a while.
Anyways, so that's my hint to you. But before I show the weight, I'll say my rating is John copied me a 7.
And copied me,
which has been there. It was there when I checked it today, so it's the rating I gave it a long time ago, so it's still the same. But yeah, same reason that you said. Basically, good, simple to learn, gateway game, family weight game. It works, and at the different player counts, it also still works, right? It doesn't completely change how it feels. It does get longer, obviously, with more players, but also not as bad as like a heavier game where then you add more players, then it gets significantly longer. So it doesn't suffer from that. And so, yeah. And again, I'm also, not like, oh, this is the game I just think about playing. Like I haven't played this game for many years now. But even just thinking about it and talking about it in this review, it's like, yeah, I'd play it again. Like I definitely don't have a problem playing it again. It's not the one I would often suggest, but that's also because I think it's because it's older. So people I would play board games with, like we probably want to play some of the newer stuff where then they might already know how King of Tokyo works or have played it before a long time ago. But yeah, definitely not a bad game. Definitely a solid one, and one I would recommend as a gateway game if you're looking to get into modern board games. This is a great one. And I think something that stuck out to me a long time ago, this isn't really influenced my rating about it, but something that impressed me about it a long time ago is by Richard Garfield, the guy who made Magic. And it's like, this is so different. Like this definitely brought my attention to him. Even just being the second game I learned was by him. It's like, dang, like he's a genius making such a different game from Magic, and one that again got so much praise and awards when it came out back then. And so that was just really cool to learn about. And so with that, going on to the Board Game Geek page and checking John's guess of the weight of 2.21.
Just because my weighting rates are totally off right now. So
is
like a 1.6, 1.4. Oh my gosh,
1.49. So from that, you guys can tell again, if you've thought during our review that it's like heavier than you think, it's pretty light. The community thing is pretty light. 1.49. Doesn't even reach a 2, which is like light medium. It's like light to light medium, like between there. And so and obviously a lot of people like it. They also give it around a 7, right? And it has like 59,000 ratings, so it is really well known. But yeah, so that's King of Tokyo. John was way off.
Yeah, it's fine.
But rating wise, we were both really close, actually. Pretty much there.
Yep.
So yeah. And so that is our review of King of Tokyo. 7 from John and a 7 from me. If you guys found this interesting, helpful. Hope you'll actually check out the game yourself. It's actually very easy to find nowadays. I believe it's in Targets and Walmarts, right? It's one that
I
made it
believe
to
so.
retail. So hope you'll get to check it out if you found this interesting. But if you found this review interesting, helpful, hope you'll share this with friends, family, people you play board game with. Hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel and follow us on Instagram at I Got Board Game. And until next time, we'll see you then. Bye.